Welcome to where time falls quiet.
History's biggest cover-up. The flood layer under our feet. Take a moment to subscribe, so this place of calm is always here for you. What if everything you know about the beginning of civilization is a lie? Not a comfortable lie, not a simple misunderstanding, but a fundamental inversion of reality so complete that we've been reading the story backwards for thousands of years. What if the first cities weren't the birth of sophistication, but the desperate reconstruction of something far older, far more advanced that ended in a single, catastrophic night? Hold that thought, because the evidence for this isn't hidden in fringe theories or disputed translations. It's carved into clay tablets sitting in university basements, embedded in geological layers that refuse to cooperate with our timeline, and encoded in mathematical systems that appeared fully formed with no period of development. The story we've been told is simple and satisfying. Humans wandered as hunter-gatherers for hundreds of thousands of years. Then suddenly, around 5,000 years ago, they invented agriculture, built cities, developed writing, and created civilization in Mesopotamia. This narrative is taught in every textbook, accepted by every institution, and it has one fatal problem. The evidence doesn't support it. When archaeologists first excavated the ancient city of Uruk in what is now Iraq, they expected to find a gradual progression from simple villages to complex urban centers. What they found instead was a city that appeared already advanced, with sophisticated canal systems, monumental architecture, and a complete writing system that showed no primitive precursor. The tablets from Uruk don't describe people learning to write. They describe people who already knew how to write, using that skill to record something that terrified them. Among the thousands of administrative texts about grain storage and temple inventories, there are documents that speak of something else entirely: warnings. These weren't mythological stories written centuries after the fact. They were contemporary accounts, clinical and precise, describing celestial disturbances, rising waters, and the systematic collapse of an ordered world. The scribes who pressed their fingerprints into that wet clay weren't creating fiction. They were documenting the end of their reality. But here's where the silence begins to hum with implications. If Sumerian civilization appeared fully formed around 3100 before the Common Era, where did the knowledge come from? The question becomes more urgent when you examine what they knew. Sumerian mathematics wasn't primitive counting. It was a sophisticated base 60 system capable of calculating astronomical cycles with precision that wouldn't be matched again until the development of modern computing. They could predict lunar eclipses, track the precession of equinoxes, and calculate the orbital periods of planets with an accuracy that suggests not trial and error, but inheritance of existing knowledge. The famous Plimpton 322 tablet, housed at Columbia University, contains a table of Pythagorean triples, calculated with a mathematical elegance that suggests deep understanding of number theory. This wasn't a civilization learning mathematics. This was a civilization that already possessed advanced mathematical knowledge and was using it for purposes we're only beginning to understand. The tablet dates to around 1800 before the Common Era, but the mathematics it contains suggests a much older tradition. The precision isn't accidental. The knowledge isn't primitive. It's the kind of sophistication that requires generations of accumulated learning, yet it appears without any archaeological evidence of that development period. Now consider the king lists. These aren't mythological genealogies invented to glorify rulers. They're administrative documents recorded in the same bureaucratic style used for tax records and building inventories. The Sumerian king list, preserved on multiple tablets and fragments, describes rulers who governed before a great flood, not after, before. The text is explicit and categorical. It divides history into two distinct eras: the kings who ruled before the flood and the kings who ruled after. The reigns of the antediluvian kings stretch impossibly long, not because the Sumerians couldn't count, but because they were recording something using a measurement system we don't fully understand. These weren't symbolic years. They were calculations. When you analyze the numbers, they're all multiples of 3600, a number that appears repeatedly in Mesopotamian astronomy and mathematics. 3600 isn't arbitrary. It's 1/10 of the precessional cycle, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that takes approximately 26,000 years to complete. The antediluvian kings weren't claimed to be immortal in the supernatural sense. Their reigns were being measured in astronomical time, in cycles that marked something far larger than individual human lifespans. They were tracking epochs, not birthdays. And then the list makes a statement that should stop you cold. After describing these long reigning rulers, their cities and their accomplishments, it says simply, "Then the flood swept over." Not "the flood myth began," or "people started telling stories about a flood." The text says the flood swept over. Past tense, definitive, factual. And then it continues. After the flood had swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. Notice the language. The kingship descended from heaven. Not created, not invented, not established. Descended, it came from somewhere else. It was restored. This isn't an isolated text making a bizarre claim. This is one of the most copied documents in ancient Mesopotamia, found in multiple cities, preserved across centuries, treated as authoritative historical record. The scribes who copied it didn't treat it as mythology. They filed it with administrative documents. They taught it in scribal schools. They referenced it in legal proceedings. For them, this was history. The flood wasn't a story their grandparents told to explain thunderstorms. The flood was the event that divided time, the boundary between the world that was and the world that came after. The question that should be echoing in your mind now is this: if the flood was real, if there were sophisticated rulers and cities before it, if the mathematics and astronomy and writing weren't invented by the Sumerians, but inherited from whoever came before, what ended that world? What could destroy a civilization so completely that its survivors had to rebuild from fragments, preserving knowledge they inherited but could barely understand? The answer isn't comfortable and it isn't abstract. It's written in layers of sediment that mark a boundary in Earth's geological record. It's preserved in flood narratives from cultures separated by oceans and millennia, all describing the same sequence of events. It's encoded in monuments built to survive catastrophe, aligned to celestial events that mark the return of destruction. The old world didn't fade away gradually. It didn't decline over centuries or collapse from internal weakness. It ended in a night of fire and water, witnessed by survivors who spent the rest of their lives trying to preserve what had been lost. The tablets don't describe the birth of civilization. They describe its resurrection. And if you believe that history is a simple march of progress from primitive to advanced, from ignorant to enlightened, then you're reading the story backwards. The sophistication was always there. We're the ones who forgot. So here's the uncomfortable truth we're going to explore together. The Sumerians, the Egyptians, the Babylonians, they weren't the first. They were the inheritors, the survivors, the children of a world that ended. And everything they built, everything they knew, everything they tried desperately to preserve in clay and stone was a memorial to something lost. The silence we hear when we stand before their monuments isn't the silence of the primitive. It's the silence of the bereaved, the silence of those who remember what was and mourn what can never return. The old world ended in a single night. This is the story of that ending, told not through myth, but through the evidence that refuses to stay buried. The warnings didn't arrive suddenly. They accumulated slowly, recorded with the same methodical precision that Mesopotamian scribes used to track barley harvests and temple expenditures. Long before the night the old world ended, something was changing in the sky, and the people who watched it weren't primitive mystics interpreting omens in animal entrails. They were astronomers working with mathematical tools sophisticated enough to predict planetary positions centuries in advance. The tablets they left behind aren't religious texts pleading with angry gods. They're observational logs, clinical and detailed, documenting phenomena that shouldn't have been visible to the naked eye but somehow were. Consider Tablet Venus Tablet of Amisaduqa, a document that records the appearances and disappearances of Venus over a 21-year period during the reign of a Babylonian king in the 17th century before the Common Era. This isn't mythology, it's raw astronomical data recorded with positional accuracy that requires systematic observation and mathematical modeling. The tablet tracks Venus as morning star and evening star, noting the precise intervals between its appearances and the political events that coincided with celestial changes. But embedded in these observations is something stranger. References to Venus behaving irregularly, appearing at unexpected intervals, vanishing when it should have been visible. The scribes noted these anomalies not as divine messages but as deviations from predicted patterns, suggesting they had models of normal planetary behavior to compare against. These observations weren't isolated to Mesopotamia. Egyptian astronomical ceilings from the tombs of pharaohs in the Valley of the Kings display the same unsettling attention to celestial irregularity. The ceiling of Senenmut's tomb, dating to approximately 1500 before the Common Era, contains a star map with a deliberate error, or rather, a deliberate correction. The constellation Orion is shown displaced from its expected position, as if the map is recording not where the stars should be according to tradition, but where they actually appeared during a specific period. This isn't artistic license. Egyptian astronomy was too precise, too systematic, too mathematically rigorous for random errors. If Orion is shown out of position, it's because Orion was observed out of position. The question becomes more urgent when you examine what else was being recorded during these periods. Mesopotamian tablets from the same era document rising water tables in agricultural regions that had been stable for centuries. These weren't flood myths being composed by poets. They were bureaucratic complaints filed by landowners whose fields were becoming waterlogged, whose irrigation canals were overflowing despite normal rainfall, whose cities were experiencing groundwater intrusion into foundations and storage chambers. The language is prosaic and irritated, the tone of administrators dealing with an infrastructure crisis they didn't understand. One tablet from the city of Larsa complains about temples requiring constant maintenance to prevent water damage, noting that the water rises from below, even during dry seasons. Now layer this with geological evidence. Core samples taken from the Persian Gulf show a dramatic sea level fluctuation during the 4th millennium before the Common Era, a rise that would have inundated coastal settlements and pushed saltwater intrusion far inland through river systems. This wasn't gradual climate change. The sediment layers show a rapid transgression, a pulse of water that transformed geography within a human lifetime. Cities that had been built on trade routes suddenly found themselves threatened by advancing coastlines. Agricultural land became marsh. Fresh water sources became brackish. And all of this is documented not just in sediment cores, but in the administrative archives of people living through it, recording the slow transformation of their world. The celestial warnings were equally systematic. Cuneiform tablets categorized as omen literature by modern scholars aren't superstitious predictions. They're astronomical event catalogues cross-referenced with historical outcomes, an attempt to build a database of pattern correlations. One class of omens specifically tracks lunar eclipses and their relationship to political instability. But the underlying observations are precise ephemeris calculations, predictions of when eclipses would occur based on mathematical models of lunar cycles. The Babylonians knew the Saros cycle, the 18-year period after which eclipse patterns repeat. They could predict eclipses decades in advance. So when tablets note eclipses occurring outside the expected cycle or behaving irregularly, these aren't mythological inventions. They're anomaly reports. What's particularly unsettling is how many different cultures recorded the same sequence of warnings during overlapping time periods. Chinese oracle bones from the Shang dynasty, roughly contemporary with Babylonian astronomical records, document similar concerns: unusual celestial phenomena, rising water levels, and agricultural disruption. Egyptian papyri from the same era mention the river rising beyond its borders during seasons when it should have been low. Harappan civilization in the Indus Valley shows archaeological evidence of massive flooding and urban abandonment around 2200 before the Common Era. These cultures had no contact with each other, used different writing systems, measured time by different calendars, yet their archives preserve parallel accounts of environmental stress. The mathematics embedded in these warning systems reveals something even more disturbing. The Babylonian astronomical texts don't just record observations, they encode predictions. The tablets calculate future positions of celestial bodies using algorithms that account for perturbations and irregularities. One text, known to scholars as Tablet Babylon 5, contains calculations for Jupiter's position that wouldn't be matched in accuracy until Johannes Kepler's work in the 17th century of the Common Era. This level of sophistication requires not just observation, but theoretical understanding of orbital mechanics. It requires computational tools and accumulated data spanning centuries, and it's being used specifically to track and predict irregular events, celestial behaviors that deviate from normal patterns. But perhaps the most chilling evidence comes from what they built in response to what they saw. During the period when these warnings were being recorded, there was an explosion of monumental construction projects across multiple civilizations. Not temples for worship, not palaces for kings, storage facilities, elevated platforms, massive stone structures designed to survive catastrophic flooding. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia, often interpreted as temples, have internal architecture that makes no sense for religious purposes. Sealed chambers, corbelled vaults, drainage systems designed to handle massive water intrusion. They're built like survival bunkers, like archives meant to preserve something through disaster. The Great Pyramid at Giza, constructed around 2560 before the Common Era according to conventional dating, contains passages and chambers that serve no obvious funerary function. The ascending passage is sealed with granite plugs weighing tons, installed from inside as if to prevent something from entering rather than leaving. The Grand Gallery, with its corbelled ceiling and mysterious stone channels, resembles nothing so much as a massive mechanical system. though for what purpose remains disputed. But consider the timing. This monument was built during the same period when Egyptian astronomical records show celestial irregularities, and when Mesopotamian tablets document rising water levels. If you were trying to preserve knowledge through a predicted catastrophe, this is exactly what you would build. A massive stone structure with sealed chambers, aligned to celestial coordinates for navigation, designed to survive flood and fire. The warning signs weren't subtle. They were systematic, documented, cross-referenced, and mathematically modeled. The ancients didn't misinterpret natural phenomena as supernatural threats. They observed, measured, calculated, and built accordingly. They saw their world changing and responded with engineering projects designed to outlast catastrophe. The tablets preserve their anxiety in the most bureaucratic language imaginable. Water tables rising, celestial positions deviating, agricultural yields declining, foundations cracking. These were people watching their civilization approach an endpoint and doing everything they could to preserve what mattered through the coming darkness. The clay remembers their fear, pressed into it by fingers that knew they were writing for an audience that hadn't been born yet. And what they wrote wasn't mythology, it was testimony. They have names, they have cities, they have documented reigns recorded in multiple independent sources using the same administrative language employed for warehouse inventories and tax records. The kings who ruled before the flood weren't mythological figures invented to fill gaps in history. They were real rulers whose governance was so significant that their memory survived the catastrophe that destroyed their world. The Sumerian king list doesn't present them as legends or gods. It presents them as administrators, builders, and lawgivers who presided over an ordered civilization. And the numbers associated with their reigns, far from being arbitrary or symbolic, encode astronomical knowledge that reveals exactly what they were measuring. The first king listed is Alulim of Eridu, credited with a reign of 28,800 years. The immediate reaction is to dismiss this as mythology, but that dismissal requires ignoring context. The king list is preserved on multiple tablets from different cities and time periods, all showing remarkable consistency in the numbers. This wasn't oral tradition mutating through retellings. This was an official document, copied by scribal schools, referenced in legal contexts, and treated as authoritative history. The scribes who recorded these reigns were the same professionals who calculated tax revenues, tracked grain storage, and maintained architectural specifications. They weren't prone to recording fantasy as fact. So what were they actually documenting? The key lies in understanding how the Babylonians measured cosmic time. Their base 60 mathematical system wasn't arbitrary. It was designed specifically for astronomical calculations. 60 divides evenly by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30, making it perfect for calculating planetary cycles and celestial periods. When you analyze the reign lengths in the king list, they're all multiples of 3600, which is 1/10 of the precessional cycle. 3600 years is the time it takes for the zodiacal precession to move through one sign. These weren't measurements of individual lifespans. They were measurements of epochs, astronomical ages during which particular celestial configurations remained dominant. Alulim's 28,800 years equals 8 times 3600. Alalgar, the second king of Eridu, is credited with 36,000 years, exactly 10 times 3600. Enmenluana of Bad Tibira ruled for 43,200 years, which is 12 times 3600. The pattern is consistent across all 8 kings who ruled before the flood. They weren't counting birthdays. They were tracking astronomical eras, periods defined by celestial mechanics rather than human biology. This is sophisticated chronometry, time measurement based on phenomena that require centuries of observation to detect and mathematical models to predict. The impossibly long rains aren't exaggerations. They're precise astronomical calculations recorded in administrative format. But here's what makes this truly unsettling. The King list doesn't treat these measurements as abstract astronomy. It connects them directly to governance, to human institutions, to cities and laws and administrative structures. It's saying that these astronomical epochs were periods of actual rule, that civilization existed in organized form through multiple precessional ages. And then, after listing these kings and their cosmic scale reigns, the text makes its devastating declaration. Then the flood swept over. The astronomical ages ended, the cities drowned, the continuity broke. And when kingship returned after the flood, the measurements changed. Post-Diluvian kings have reigns measured in years we can recognize as human lifespans. Decades, not millennia. The flood marks the boundary between two different systems of time measurement. This isn't unique to Mesopotamia. Egyptian king lists show a similar pattern, dividing history into the reign of gods, the reign of demigods, and the reign of mortal pharaohs. The Turin King papyrus, though fragmentary, preserves this tripartite structure. The divine reign section lists impossibly long periods that, like the Sumerian figures, appear to track astronomical rather than biographical time. The Palermo stone, one of the oldest Egyptian historical texts, begins its chronology with followers of Horus, who ruled before the first human dynasty. These aren't creation myths. They're chronological frameworks that treat pre-catastrophe history as fundamentally different in scale and organization from post-catastrophe rebuilding. The Manetho fragments preserve Egyptian tradition that speaks of dynasties ruling for thousands of years before the reign of Menes, the first historically verified pharaoh. Manetho was a priest and historian writing in the 3rd century before the Common Era, compiling records from temple archives that stretched back millennia. He had access to documents we no longer possess, king lists and astronomical tables that survived in temple libraries. His account divides Egyptian history into godly reigns, demigod reigns, and human reigns, with the transition marked by a great catastrophe that ended the previous age. The chronology he preserves, though often dismissed as mythology, follows the same pattern as the Sumerian lists. Astronomical time measurements preceding a catastrophic break, followed by human-scale chronology. What did these antediluvian kings actually do? The texts are specific. They established law, they built irrigation systems, they organized urban planning, they codified writing. The king list attributes the founding of kingship itself to divine decree, saying that kingship descended from heaven to Eridu. But it doesn't describe this as supernatural intervention. It describes it as the establishment of organized governance, as if kingship, the concept of centralized administration, was knowledge that arrived from elsewhere rather than developing organically. The first king, Alulim, is credited with receiving the Emi, the Sumerian term for the fundamental principles of civilization, not inventing them, receiving them. The cities these kings ruled were real. Eridu has been excavated. It sits beneath layers of flood sediment that mark a catastrophic inundation event. The lowest levels show sophisticated architecture and urban planning that appeared without developmental precursors. Bad Tabira has been identified archaeologically. Sippar, Shuruppak, Lhasa, these cities named in the king list are verified locations whose archaeological profiles show sudden abandonment during flood events, followed by later reoccupation. The kings weren't mythological. The cities weren't mythological. The administration they presided over wasn't mythological. What's mythological is our insistence that the chronology must conform to our assumptions about how time should be measured. Consider what this means. If the antediluvian kings were tracking astronomical ages, they possessed knowledge of precession, planetary cycles, and celestial mechanics that required not just observation, but mathematical modeling. They understood that Earth's axis wobbles through a 26,000-year cycle. They could calculate when zodiacal ages would transition. They organized their governance around these cosmic timescales, as if their administration was designed to last through astronomical epochs. This isn't primitive astronomy noting that seasons change. This is sophisticated cosmology understanding that the sky itself changes position over millennia. And they built their civilization to operate across those timescales. Then the flood came. The king list records it matter-of-factly. The deluge swept over, and when it receded, kingship had to be re-established. But notice what survived. The memory of who ruled before, the knowledge of how time was measured, the understanding that civilization had existed in a form far more sophisticated than what came after. The post-diluvian kings inherited fragments of antediluvian knowledge. They rebuilt using blueprints they couldn't fully understand. They preserved the king list not as mythology but as administrative continuity, proof that their authority descended from legitimate predecessors who ruled during the time before the world ended. The kings before the flood weren't gods. They were humans operating with knowledge we've only recently begun to rediscover, governing a civilization that measured itself against the stars and fell when the sky and sea conspired to reset time itself. They didn't build monuments to glorify themselves. They built monuments to survive what they knew was coming. When you stand before the Great Pyramid at Giza, you're not looking at a tomb. You're looking at an archive designed to outlast catastrophe. Every dimension, every angle, every passage has been carved with mathematical precision that encodes knowledge too valuable to lose. The stone doesn't speak through hieroglyphs celebrating pharaohs. It speaks through geometry that preserves astronomical coordinates, geodetic measurements, and mathematical constants that wouldn't be formally discovered again until the 19th century. This wasn't architecture for the living or the dead. This was architecture for whoever survived to rebuild. The precision is unsettling in its implications. The Great Pyramid's base is level to within 2.1 centimeters across a foundation covering 13 acres. The four sides align to the cardinal directions with an average error of 3 minutes of arc, less than 1/20th of a degree. This accuracy requires surveying instruments and geodetic knowledge that shouldn't exist in a civilization supposedly working with copper tools and rope. But the precision isn't random. The latitude of the pyramid, 29.9792 degrees north, is extremely close to exactly 30 degrees, placing it 1/3 of the way from the equator to the North Pole. The structure sits at a geodetic marker, positioned as if to serve as a reference point for navigation or mapping of the entire planet. The dimensions encode mathematical relationships that suggest intentional preservation of knowledge. The ratio of the pyramid's perimeter to its height is 2 pi, the same ratio as a circle's circumference to its radius. This wasn't approximation. The builders chose dimensions specifically to preserve this relationship in stone. The pyramid's height of 146.6 meters, when multiplied by 43,200, that same astronomical number from the king lists, equals Earth's polar radius with accuracy that wasn't achieved by modern surveying until the 20th century. Either this is coincidence on a scale that defies probability, or the builders knew Earth's dimensions and encoded them deliberately into the structure's proportions. But the most revealing aspect is what the pyramid protects. Deep within the structure, above the so-called King's Chamber, are 5 stress-relieving chambers constructed with granite blocks weighing up to 80 tons each. The standard explanation is that these chambers prevent the ceiling from collapsing under the weight of the pyramid above. But analyze the engineering. The corbelled ceiling design used in the Grand Gallery and the chambers is already sufficient to handle compressive forces from above. The additional chambers are over-engineered by any reasonable structural analysis, unless they're not protecting against compressive weight, unless they're protecting against something else, seismic stress, perhaps, or hydrostatic pressure from flooding. The internal passages tell the same story. The ascending passage is sealed with granite plugs installed from inside, wedged into place with a precision that makes them effectively permanent. The traditional explanation is that these plugs were meant to protect the pharaoh's burial chamber from tomb robbers. But tomb robbers don't excavate through hundreds of feet of solid limestone to bypass a few granite blocks. The plugs aren't deterrents, they're seals, designed to keep something out or keep something in, to preserve an internal environment regardless of external conditions. The descending passage, meanwhile, plunges into bedrock below the pyramid, terminating in a chamber carved from living rock. This chamber is unfinished by conventional interpretation, but its position deep underground and its connection to the structure above suggest a different purpose. Redundancy, a secondary storage location in case the upper chambers were compromised. Now consider the alignment. The pyramid's passages align to specific celestial coordinates, particularly the so-called air shafts from the king's and queen's chambers. These shafts aren't air circulation. They're sealed at both ends in the original construction. When you calculate their angles, they point to specific stars. The southern shaft from the king's chamber aimed at Orion's belt, the northern shaft aimed at Thuban, the pole star of that era. These aren't decorative choices, they're navigational markers, celestial coordinates preserved in stone. If you needed to reconstruct astronomical knowledge after a catastrophe, you would need reference points. The pyramid provides them, immutable and precise, aligned to configurations that can be dated and verified. The construction itself demonstrates urgency and purpose beyond pharaonic ego. The estimated 2.3 million limestone blocks, some weighing 15 tons, were quarried, transported, and assembled with tolerances measured in millimeters. The mortar joints between blocks are 1/50th of an inch, thinner than most modern construction. This level of precision isn't necessary for a tomb. It's necessary for a structure meant to preserve dimensional accuracy across millennia, to resist settling and erosion, to maintain its geometric relationships regardless of environmental stress. The builders weren't creating a monument. They were creating a time capsule, a geometric treatise written in stone. This pattern repeats across ancient construction. The megalithic walls of Sacsayhuaman in Peru, built with stones weighing over 200 tons, fit together with precision that requires modern laser measurement to verify. There's no mortar, no gaps, just massive polygonal blocks fitted with such exactness that you cannot insert a knife blade between them. These walls aren't defensive fortifications, they're massively over-engineered for that purpose. They're structures built to survive earthquakes, flooding, and any other geological catastrophe. The Andean region is seismically active, yet these walls have stood for thousands of years, while colonial-era construction has crumbled around them. The builders knew what forces their structures needed to withstand. The megaliths at Baalbek in Lebanon present the same pattern. The foundation stones of the Temple of Jupiter include the trilithon, 3 blocks each weighing approximately 800 tons. Conventional archaeology attributes this to Roman construction, but the Romans built on top of these foundations. They didn't create them. The stones beneath the Roman temple are fitted with the same precision seen in Egyptian and Peruvian megalithic work, suggesting a common engineering tradition that predates all 3 cultures. And like the Great Pyramid, the Baalbek complex sits at a significant latitude, positioned as if for geodetic reference rather than religious convenience. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, dated to approximately 9600 before the Common Era, supposedly built by hunter-gatherers who hadn't yet invented agriculture, shows the same sophisticated engineering. The T-shaped pillars weighing up to 20 tons each are carved from bedrock and positioned in circular arrangements that require surveying and planning tools. The site was deliberately buried, filled in with rubble, and sealed, as if to preserve it through expected catastrophe. This wasn't abandonment. This was intentional preservation, the same impulse that drove the construction of sealed chambers in the Great Pyramid. The message encoded in all this architecture is consistent. Something was ending, and knowledge needed to survive. The monuments weren't built as temples or tombs or palaces. They were built as archives, preservation systems using the most durable medium available, stone, to encode information in the most universal language available, geometry. The builders knew that writing systems might be lost, languages forgotten, but mathematical relationships are universal. A right angle remains a right angle. The ratio of pi remains constant. The cardinal directions remain fixed. By encoding knowledge in geometric relationships and celestial alignments, they created a backup system that could be decoded by any sufficiently advanced civilization that came after, even if that civilization had no cultural connection to the builders. This is architecture born of desperation, masquerading as confidence. The precision, the scale, the over-engineering, these aren't expressions of power, they're expressions of fear. Fear that what was known would be lost. Fear that the catastrophe approaching would erase not just cities, but memory itself. Fear that those who survived would need every possible advantage to rebuild, and that knowledge preserved in stone might be the difference between restoration and permanent regression. The monuments stand not as testaments to human achievement, but as warnings from people who knew their world was ending and did everything they could to pass the torch across the darkness. They built for us whoever we turned out to be, hoping that we would be wise enough to read what they wrote in stone. It didn't happen gradually. There was no centuries-long decline, no slow fade into chaos, no gentle transition from one age to another. The world that existed before ended in a single night of fire and water, darkness and destruction so complete that survivors struggled to find words adequate to describe what they had witnessed. This wasn't myth-making by later generations trying to explain natural disasters they didn't understand. This was testimony from people who lived through it, recorded in multiple independent cultures separated by oceans and continents, all describing the same sequence of events with details too specific and too consistent to be coincidental. The Sumerian accounts are clinical in their horror. The Eridu Genesis, one of the oldest flood narratives in existence, describes the sequence with bureaucratic precision. First came the darkness. Not the darkness of night, but an unnatural darkness that descended during daylight hours, as if something had obscured the sun. Then came the wind, not weather, but a force that tore at structures and filled the air with debris. Then fire from above, not lightning, not volcanic eruption, but something described as fire raining from the sky, in quantities and patterns that terrified observers who had witnessed thunderstorms and understood natural phenomena. Finally came the water, not as seasonal flooding but as a wall that swept across the land, obliterating cities and drowning valleys in a matter of hours. The Epic of Gilgamesh preserves testimony from Utnapishtim, the flood survivor, describing the event from the perspective of someone who witnessed it firsthand. He speaks of 6 days and 7 nights of deluge, but before the water came, he describes all daylight turned to darkness and fire blazing. The sky itself seemed to break, he says, with the foundations of the earth groaning in response. This isn't poetic exaggeration. It's someone trying to communicate an experience that violated every assumption about how reality was supposed to function. The water that came wasn't rain. It was described as the springs of the deep opening, as if water surged from below ground as well as falling from above. A hydraulic catastrophe on a scale that suggested planetary rather than regional forces. Now cross-reference this with accounts from cultures that had no contact with Mesopotamia. The Rig Veda, one of the oldest texts from the Indian subcontinent, describes a cosmic catastrophe involving darkness, fire, and flood. The hymns speak of the sky falling to earth, of fire and water combining in destructive union, of mountains crumbling and rivers abandoning their courses. Chinese legends preserved in texts like the Huainanzi describe a time when the pillars of heaven were broken and the corners of the earth gave way, followed by fire that burned without ceasing and floods that covered everything. These aren't derivative accounts borrowed from Middle Eastern sources. These are independent testimonies from geographically isolated cultures describing identical phenomena. The Americas preserve the same memory. The Popol Vuh of the Maya describes a flood preceded by darkness and fire from the sky, explicitly stating that this catastrophe destroyed the previous world and forced the gods to recreate humanity. The text is specific about the sequence. First, the darkening of the sky, then burning rain, then the flood that swept away everything. North American indigenous traditions across multiple tribes describe similar events. The Ojibwe speak of fire from the sky, followed by waters that covered the earth. The Hopi describe a world that ended in flood after the sky became darkened and fire rained down. These narratives weren't borrowed from Christian missionaries or colonial influences. They existed in oral tradition long before European contact, preserved with consistency across generations. What could cause this specific sequence of phenomena, darkness, fire, water, to occur simultaneously on a global scale? The answer becomes clear when you examine the geological record. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica show a distinct layer dating to approximately 10,800 years before the Common Era, marked by elevated levels of iridium and shocked quartz, signatures of extraterrestrial impact. This layer coincides with a dramatic temperature spike, followed by rapid cooling, evidence of massive atmospheric disruption. The sediment cores show a sudden increase in oceanic sediment deposition, suggesting catastrophic flooding events across multiple continents during this period. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis proposes that a comet or asteroid fragmented in Earth's atmosphere, with pieces impacting the North American ice sheet and possibly other locations. The impact would have vaporized massive amounts of ice instantly, sending water vapor into the atmosphere while simultaneously triggering megafloods from the sudden melting. The debris and ejecta would have blocked sunlight, creating the darkness described in the accounts. The atmospheric friction from fragments entering the atmosphere would have created intense heat and fire, appearing as burning rain to observers on the ground. The pressure waves from impacts would have triggered earthquakes and tsunamis, explaining the descriptions of the earth groaning and waters surging from below. the Hiawatha crater in Greenland. Discovered beneath ice using radar imaging, shows impact characteristics consistent with this timeline. The crater is 31 kilometers wide, suggesting an impactor approximately 1.5 kilometers in diameter. An object of this size fragmenting in the atmosphere and impacting ice sheets would release energy equivalent to thousands of nuclear weapons, triggering exactly the sequence of effects described in ancient accounts. But this wasn't a single impact point. Evidence suggests multiple fragments hit across a wide area, creating what witnesses would perceive as fire falling from multiple directions simultaneously. The water came from multiple sources. The impact triggered melting of North American ice sheets released an estimated volume equivalent to all the Great Lakes, emptying in a matter of days. This water had to go somewhere. It flowed through existing drainage systems, overwhelming them, creating temporary superlakes that burst through natural dams and scoured channels through bedrock. The channeled scablands of Washington state preserve evidence of catastrophic flooding on this scale, water moving with such volume and velocity that it stripped soil from bedrock and carried boulders the size of houses hundreds of kilometers. This wasn't hypothetical. The geological evidence is unambiguous. Simultaneously, the atmospheric disruption caused climate chaos. The sudden injection of water vapor, dust, and debris into the atmosphere triggered torrential rain across much of the planet. Temperature differentials created superstorms, atmospheric rivers of moisture that dumped precipitation at rates far exceeding normal weather patterns. Coastal regions experienced storm surges driven by atmospheric pressure changes, and possibly tsunami events from oceanic impacts or submarine earthquakes, triggered by the crustal stress. The result was water coming from above and below simultaneously, exactly as described in the ancient accounts. For people on the ground, this was the end of the world. Cities built on river valleys were swept away. Coastal settlements vanished beneath waves. Agricultural regions became inland seas. The darkness lasted for weeks, perhaps months, as atmospheric dust blocked sunlight. When the sun finally returned, survivors emerged to find their world transformed. Familiar landscapes buried beneath sediment, rivers flowing in new courses, coastlines reshaped, and the vast majority of their population gone. The trauma of this event imprinted itself so deeply in human consciousness that it became the defining memory of every culture that survived it. The night the sky fell wasn't mythology. It was history, the most traumatic history humanity has ever experienced. An event so catastrophic that it reset civilization, erased cities, and forced survivors to rebuild from fragments. The consistency of the accounts across isolated cultures isn't coincidence, it's testimony. These people lived through something that shouldn't have been survivable, and they spent the rest of their lives trying to warn whoever came after that the sky had fallen once and could fall again. The geological record confirms their testimony. The impact evidence validates their fear. The flood layer in archaeological sites worldwide marks the boundary between the world that was and the world that came after. And on that boundary, everything changed. There is a line in the earth where everything changes. It's not subtle, not gradual, not open to interpretation. It's a physical boundary you can touch with your hands, a layer of sediment that marks the exact moment when one world ended and another began. Below this line, sophisticated urban planning, advanced metallurgy, astronomical knowledge encoded in architecture, writing systems recording complex administrative hierarchies. Above this line, a restart, a scramble to remember. Cultures rebuilding from whatever fragments they could salvage. The sediment doesn't care about academic theories or comfortable narratives. It records what happened with geological precision, and what it records is catastrophe. Archaeologist Leonard Woolley discovered this boundary in the 1920s while excavating the ancient city of Ur in southern Iraq. He was digging through occupation layers, tracking the progression of Sumerian civilization downward through time, when his workers hit something unexpected: a layer of clean water-laid sediment over 3 meters thick, containing no artifacts, no pottery shards, no evidence of human habitation. Beneath this sterile layer, civilization continued. Different pottery styles, different architectural techniques, but clearly sophisticated urban culture. The flood layer sat like a knife cut through history, dividing 2 distinct civilizations. Woolley's workers, local Arabs familiar with ancient traditions, immediately recognized what they'd found. They told Woolley without hesitation, "We have reached the flood." This wasn't an isolated discovery. The same flood layer has been identified at multiple Mesopotamian sites: Uruk, Kish, Shuruppak, Lagash, Nineveh. The depth varies by location and elevation, but the characteristics remain consistent. Water-deposited sediment containing no cultural material, overlying occupation layers that show sudden abandonment, topped by new occupation layers that show cultural discontinuity with what came before. This isn't seasonal river flooding, which leaves thin, annual deposits mixed with human debris. This is catastrophic inundation that scoured existing settlements, deposited meters of sediment in a single event, and created such complete disruption that when people returned, they were effectively starting over. The sedimentology tells a specific story. The flood layer consists of fine silt and clay, deposited in slack water conditions, not the coarse gravel you'd expect from high-velocity river flooding, but the fine particles that settle when water stands still for extended periods. This indicates that after the initial catastrophic surge, water remained standing for weeks or months, allowing fine sediments to settle uniformly. The thickness of the deposit, in some locations exceeding 4 meters, requires either an enormous volume of water or an extended period of inundation, most likely both. Chemical analysis of the sediment shows it's not local riverine material exclusively. It contains marine indicators suggesting saltwater intrusion from the Persian Gulf, mixing with fresh water from riverine sources. But the flood layer isn't unique to Mesopotamia. The Black Sea deluge hypothesis, supported by marine geology, proposes that the Black Sea was originally a freshwater lake at a much lower elevation than today. Around 5500 before the Common Era, rising Mediterranean sea levels breached the Bosphorus Strait, causing salt water to cascade into the Black Sea basin with a force estimated at 200 times the volume of Niagara Falls. The resulting flood would have raised the Black Sea level by over 100 meters, inundating approximately 100,000 square kilometers of coastal settlements. Sediment cores from the Black Sea floor show a distinct boundary layer where freshwater lake deposits transition abruptly to saltwater marine sediments, marking this catastrophic flooding event. Archaeological surveys of the Black Sea coast have identified drowned settlements at depths consistent with pre-flood shorelines. These aren't gradual sea level rise adaptations, they're sudden abandonments, with structures showing no signs of planned evacuation or dismantling. The residents fled with whatever they could carry, leaving behind pottery, tools, and building foundations now sitting beneath meters of water. The survivors of this flooding would have been displaced en masse, forced to migrate inland or to higher elevations, carrying memories of catastrophe and lost homes. This displacement may explain the sudden appearance of agricultural communities in regions of Eastern Europe and Anatolia during this period. Not indigenous development, but refugee populations bringing existing knowledge to new locations. In North America, The flood evidence is written in landscape rather than sediment layers. The channeled scablands of eastern Washington state show erosion patterns that can only be explained by catastrophic flooding, water moving at velocities and volumes far exceeding any modern river system. The prevailing geological theory for decades was gradualism, the idea that landscapes form slowly through normal erosion processes. The scablands violate this theory completely. They show massive water erosion through solid basalt bedrock, creating channels hundreds of meters deep, carrying boulders the size of houses, and depositing gravel bars at elevations that require flow depths of over 300 meters. This wasn't river flooding. This was a continental-scale hydraulic catastrophe. The source was Lake Missoula, an ice-dammed lake that formed during the last glacial period. When the ice dam failed, likely due to seismic activity or ice sheet instability, approximately 2,000 cubic kilometers of water released in a matter of days. The resulting flood scoured everything in its path, creating the scablands topography and depositing flood debris across thousands of square kilometers. But here's what makes this relevant to the global picture: the timing. Radiocarbon dating places the last major Missoula flood at approximately 13,000 years before the Common Era, overlapping with other evidence of catastrophic flooding worldwide. The ice dam failures weren't isolated events. They were triggered by the same climatic chaos and possible impact events that cause flooding in other regions. Australia preserves flood narratives among Aboriginal cultures that describe the sea rising and swallowing coastal lands. These aren't vague creation myths. They're geographically specific accounts naming particular bays and islands that became submerged. Geological surveys confirm that sea levels around Australia rose dramatically at the end of the last glacial period, inundating vast coastal plains. What's remarkable is that Aboriginal oral traditions preserve accurate descriptions of pre-flood geography, landscapes that have been underwater for over 10,000 years. The stories describe specific hunting grounds, fresh water sources, and tribal territories that existed when the coast was hundreds of kilometers seaward of its current position. These memories survived 100 generations of oral transmission, proving that catastrophic events imprint themselves deeply enough in cultural memory to transcend millennia. The flood layer isn't just sediment, it's a boundary between two different states of human civilization. Below the line, there's evidence of sophisticated cultures with advanced knowledge systems. Above the line, there's evidence of rebuilding, of cultures that arrived with knowledge they couldn't have developed independently in the time available. The Sumerian cities above the flood layer show fully formed writing, mathematics, and astronomy with no developmental period. Egyptian civilization appears in the historical record already sophisticated, with no clear evolutionary path from primitive to advanced. The Indus Valley civilization emerges with standardized weights, measures, and urban planning that suggests inheritance of existing systems rather than gradual development. The flood layer marks the reset point, the moment when accumulated knowledge nearly died but was preserved by desperate survivors who passed it forward. Core samples from ocean floors worldwide show increased sediment deposition rates during this period, indicating that rivers were carrying massive sediment loads from terrestrial flooding into the oceans. This wasn't regional flooding affecting one river system. This was global hydrological disruption affecting every major watershed simultaneously. The mechanism that could cause this, the impact event described in the previous chapter, explains both the timing and the global distribution. The flood layer is the physical record of that event, preserved in stratigraphy across multiple continents. When you stand at an archaeological site and look at the exposed stratigraphy, the flood layer is immediately obvious even to untrained eyes. It's the clean break, the sterile sediment that separates everything that came before from everything that came after. Below, civilization. Above, reconstruction. The boundary is so stark, so absolute, that it demands explanation. And the explanation written in the sediment isn't comfortable. It says that the old world ended completely, that survival was marginal, and that what we call the beginning of civilization was actually its desperate restoration by people who barely survived losing everything. The flood layer is a grave marker for a world that drowned, and a birth certificate for a world that rose from the water forever changed. They emerged from the darkness carrying knowledge that shouldn't exist. Not knowledge they had developed themselves, not skills learned through trial and error, but complete systems of mathematics, astronomy, agriculture, and metallurgy that they inherited from a world that no longer existed. These survivors faced an impossible burden. They possessed sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics, architectural engineering, and agricultural science, but they inhabited a world stripped of the infrastructure and resources needed to apply that knowledge fully. They were engineers without cities, astronomers without observatories, priests without temples. And they had to choose what to preserve and how to pass it forward to descendants who might not understand its importance. The evidence of this burden is written in every foundation myth of post-flood civilizations. The Sumerian accounts don't describe gods teaching humans how to farm. They describe the me, the fundamental principles of civilization, being given to humanity already complete. These weren't lessons in how to develop agriculture. They were instructions for implementing existing systems. The texts describe specific cultivation techniques, irrigation engineering, and crop rotation methods arriving as received wisdom rather than discovered practice. Enki, the Sumerian god of wisdom, doesn't invent knowledge. He transfers it, preserves it, carries it from the antediluvian world into the post-flood reality. The mythology is transparent about this. Civilization wasn't created after the flood. It was restored. The Egyptian tradition is equally explicit. The Edfu building texts inscribed on the walls of the Temple of Horus at Edfu describe the reconstruction of civilization by the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus, who possessed knowledge from before the flood. These texts don't describe primitive people slowly developing culture. They describe knowledgeable survivors implementing a deliberate plan to rebuild, following sacred architectural principles and astronomical alignments that they inherited rather than invented. The texts refer repeatedly to the former time, the age before destruction when the gods walked among men. But the gods in these accounts aren't supernatural beings. They're the knowledge bearers, the survivors who carried the wisdom of the old world into the new. This burden of impossible knowledge created a fundamental problem. How do you preserve sophisticated information for a population that has been reduced to survival-level existence? The survivors couldn't assume that their immediate descendants would have the education, resources, or stability to understand advanced astronomy or complex mathematics. They had to encode knowledge in forms that could survive cultural collapse, that could be passed down even if the explanations were lost. The solution was to embed knowledge in structures, rituals, and stories, to make the preservation of information itself sacred, so that even if understanding faded, the transmission would continue. This is why ancient temples functioned simultaneously as astronomical observatories and architectural textbooks. The Temple of Karnak in Egypt encodes the precessional cycle in its alignment and proportions. The temple's axis points to the winter solstice sunrise, but calculations show that the building was designed to track the slow shift of that sunrise position over millennia as Earth's axis precesses. The builders weren't creating a monument for their own use. They were creating a long-term educational tool, a physical demonstration of astronomical principles that would remain functional even if the mathematical understanding was forgotten. The structure itself teaches, independent of written explanations or oral tradition. The same principle appears in Stonehenge, in the medicine wheels of North America, in the stone circles of Göbekli Tepe. These aren't primitive worship sites. They're astronomical calculators and calendrical computers built by people who needed to preserve precise timekeeping and celestial observation capabilities through periods of cultural instability. The arrangements encode information about solar and lunar cycles, seasonal transitions, and stellar positions. You can use these structures to predict eclipses, calculate optimal planting dates, and track long-term astronomical cycles without understanding the mathematics behind them. You just need to maintain the observation protocols and follow the patterns. The survivors built redundancy into the knowledge preservation system because they knew that understanding might not survive, but practice could. The burden manifested psychologically as well. The survivors lived with the trauma of having witnessed the end of everything familiar, the loss of the vast majority of their population, and the knowledge that it could happen again. This trauma imprinted itself into their cultural expressions. The obsession with floods in Mesopotamian literature isn't mythology, it's PTSD at civilizational scale. Gilgamesh doesn't seek immortality because he fears his own death abstractly. He seeks it because he has met Utnapishtim, the flood survivor who lives outside normal time, who carries memories of the world before. Gilgamesh wants the knowledge that Utnapishtim possesses, the understanding of how to preserve civilization through catastrophe. The burden also created a class system based on knowledge preservation. The priest castes that emerge in post-flood civilizations aren't simply religious authorities, they're knowledge keepers, guardians of information considered too important to be left to chance transmission. Egyptian priests underwent decades of training in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and engineering. Sumerian scribes studied in temple schools for years, learning not just writing, but the mathematical and astronomical principles needed to maintain calendars and predict celestial events. These weren't superstitious mystics. They were the surviving educational system of a collapsed civilization, desperately maintaining knowledge that the general population no longer had the resources or stability to learn. This explains the recurring motif of forbidden knowledge in ancient texts. The Book of Enoch describes angels teaching humanity astronomy, metallurgy, and agriculture, knowledge that brings both advancement and corruption. But this isn't a moral parable about the dangers of learning. It's a memory of knowledge arriving from outside the normal developmental process, possessed by survivors who seemed to have divine understanding, because they knew things that couldn't have been learned in the time available. The forbidden aspect comes from the survivors' understanding that this knowledge was dangerous. It came from a civilization that had been destroyed, possibly because of how they used what they knew. The survivors faced an ethical dilemma that haunts their texts. Should they rebuild exactly what existed before, or should they modify civilization to avoid repeating whatever mistakes led to catastrophe? The Babylonian Enuma Elish describes the ordering of the cosmos from chaos, but it's not describing initial creation. It's describing reconstruction, the deliberate choice of which principles to restore and which to leave behind. The text emphasizes divine authority and hierarchical order, suggesting that the survivors chose to rebuild civilization with stronger, centralized control than may have existed previously, perhaps believing that decentralization or individual freedom had contributed to the catastrophe. The burden also manifested in architecture designed for memory rather than function. The pyramids, the ziggurats, the megalithic temples, these structures are over-engineered to a degree that makes sense only if you're building for permanence across catastrophic events. The survivors built as if they expected another flood, another fire from the sky, another period of darkness. They built redundantly, massively, with mathematical encoding that could survive even if the structures were damaged. They built for us, for whoever would come after the next catastrophe, embedding knowledge in stone because stone was the only medium they trusted to survive what they had survived. The psychological weight of this burden explains the recurring theme of the wise elder, the keeper of ancient knowledge in myths across cultures. These figures, Thoth in Egypt, Enki in Mesopotamia, Quetzalcoatl in Mesoamerica, Viracocha in South America, aren't gods in the supernatural sense. They're cultural memories of the survivors, the knowledge bearers who bridged the catastrophe, who possessed understanding that seemed divine because it came from a world that no longer existed. They taught what they remembered, built what they could, and spent their lives trying to ensure that their descendants wouldn't lose what they had barely managed to save. And they failed. Not completely, but substantially. The knowledge they tried to preserve degraded with each generation. The mathematics became ritual formulas. The astronomy became astrology. The engineering became sacred mystery. The survivors' desperate attempt to encode knowledge in every available medium, stone, story, structure, ceremony, succeeded in preserving fragments, but the complete system was lost. What we inherited wasn't their knowledge, it was their effort to preserve it. We're reading the textbook they wrote, but we're missing the context that would make the lessons fully comprehensible. And that loss, that gap between what they knew and what we recovered, is the measure of how completely the old world ended. Everything you were taught about the birth of civilization is backwards. The moment when writing appeared, when mathematics emerged, when monumental architecture began, these weren't inventions. They were reconstructions. The sophistication that suddenly appears in the archaeological record around 3000 before the Common Era wasn't the product of recent innovation. It was the restoration of knowledge that already existed, preserved through catastrophe by survivors who spent their lives trying to rebuild what had been lost. The evidence for this isn't speculative. It's written in the artifacts themselves, in the complete absence of developmental stages, in the sudden appearance of fully formed systems that should have required centuries to evolve, but instead arrived overnight. Sumerian writing provides the clearest example. When cuneiform script appears in the archaeological record around 3200 before the Common Era, it's already sophisticated. There are no primitive precursors, no gradual evolution from simple pictographs to complex phonetic representation. The earliest tablets from Uruk show a complete writing system capable of expressing abstract concepts, grammatical relationships, and complex administrative procedures. This isn't how writing develops. Every other writing system we can study shows clear evolutionary stages. Egyptian hieroglyphs evolved from simple pictographs over centuries. Chinese characters show progressive elaboration. Mayan glyphs demonstrate gradual sophistication. But Sumerian cuneiform appears fully formed, as if the scribes who used it were copying an existing system rather than inventing one. The content of those early tablets reveals the same pattern. They're not practice exercises or experimental texts. They're administrative documents recording complex transactions, legal procedures, and astronomical observations using standardized formats and technical vocabulary. The bureaucratic sophistication is immediate. There's no learning curve visible in the archaeological record. One generation has no writing. The next generation has complete administrative archives using specialized terminology and standardized procedures. This timeline is impossible if writing was being invented. It's entirely consistent with writing being restored, with scribes implementing a system they had learned from teachers who remembered how it worked before the flood. The mathematics tells the same story. Babylonian mathematical tablets don't show a civilization learning to count and gradually developing more sophisticated operations. They show complete mathematical systems appearing suddenly, including place value notation, zero concepts, and algorithms for calculating astronomical phenomena that wouldn't be matched in accuracy until the development of modern computing. Plimpton 322, that tablet containing Pythagorean triples, doesn't represent a mathematician discovering the Pythagorean theorem. It represents someone using the Pythagorean theorem as an already known tool, applying it to generate tables of values for purposes we still don't fully understand. The sophistication is embedded, assumed, taken for granted rather than being derived or explained. Consider what's required to develop base 60 mathematics from scratch. You need to recognize that 60 has unique divisibility properties. You need to experiment with different number bases and determine that 60 is superior for astronomical calculations. You need to develop notation systems that distinguish between place values. You need to generate tables of multiplication, division, and powers. This process should leave archaeological evidence, practice tablets, teaching materials, texts explaining the system's principles. Instead, the earliest mathematical tablets assume the reader already understands base 60 notation. They're application documents, not educational materials. They're written for users of an existing system, not learners of a new one. Egyptian architecture demonstrates the same pattern of restoration rather than invention. The step pyramid of Djoser, supposedly one of the earliest major stone structures, shows construction techniques that required sophisticated understanding of weight distribution, stress management, and material properties. But there are no earlier structures showing experimental phases, no evidence of architects learning through failure how to build with stone. The construction jumps from mud brick to massive stone architecture in a single generation, using techniques that appear fully mature. The subsequent evolution of pyramid construction doesn't show increasing sophistication. It shows increasing efficiency in applying already understood principles. They weren't learning how to build pyramids. They were refining methods for implementing existing architectural knowledge. The precision of Egyptian surveying reinforces this conclusion. The Great Pyramid's alignment to cardinal directions within minutes of arc isn't beginner's luck or gradual improvement. It's the application of sophisticated geodetic knowledge from the first attempt. There are no practice pyramids showing progressively better alignment. The precision appears immediately, suggesting that the surveyors were using inherited techniques rather than developing new ones. The mathematical ratios encoded in the pyramid's dimensions, phi, pi, Earth's dimensions, aren't the result of trial and error. They're the deliberate application of knowledge about these constants to create a lasting record of that knowledge. Metallurgy provides equally compelling evidence. Bronze working requires understanding complex relationships between copper and tin ratios, smelting temperatures, and cooling processes. Getting these relationships wrong produces unusable metal, too brittle, too soft, or too difficult to work. The learning curve for bronze metallurgy should be visible in the archaeological record as failed experiments, inferior metal, and progressive refinement. Instead, bronze appears in the historical record already optimized, with metal compositions and working techniques that suggest complete understanding of the process. The earliest bronze artifacts aren't primitive experiments. They're finished products demonstrating mastery of the technology. The agricultural systems that appear after the flood show the same pattern. Mesopotamian irrigation engineering involves complex calculations of water flow, sediment management, and long-term maintenance requirements. Getting irrigation wrong leads to salinization, flooding, or water shortage, mistakes that should be visible archaeologically as abandoned field systems and failed canal networks. Instead, the earliest irrigation systems show sophisticated design that avoided these problems from the beginning. The farmers weren't learning through trial and error how to manage water. They were implementing systems designed by people who already understood hydraulic engineering principles. Legal systems provide particularly striking evidence of restoration. The Code of Hammurabi, dating to 1750 before the Common Era, isn't a simple collection of tribal customs gradually codified. It's a sophisticated legal framework covering commercial law, property rights, family law, and criminal justice with nuance that suggests centuries of legal philosophy development. But there's no archaeological evidence of that development, no earlier law codes showing progressive sophistication. The code appears fully formed, comprehensive and detailed, as if Hammurabi was codifying existing legal principles rather than inventing new ones. The preamble to the code makes this explicit, stating that the laws were given to him by the gods, meaning inherited from the knowledge bearers, the survivors who remembered how justice was administered before. The astronomical knowledge embedded in ancient calendars reveals the same pattern. The Mesopotamian calendar required understanding of lunar cycles, solar years, and the mathematical relationship between them, knowledge that takes generations of careful observation to accumulate. Yet the calendar appears in the historical record already refined, with intercalation systems that keep lunar and solar cycles synchronized. There are no intermediate calendars showing progressive accuracy improvement. The system appears complete, suggesting it was restored from pre-existing knowledge rather than developed through observation of post-flood, celestial patterns. This pattern repeats across every domain of ancient civilization. Agriculture, architecture, mathematics, writing, law, astronomy. All appear fully formed without the developmental stages that innovation requires. The standard explanation is that evidence of development hasn't been found yet, that the learning phase happened in materials that don't preserve or locations that haven't been excavated. But this explanation requires believing in a conspiracy of absence, that every civilization independently lost all evidence of its learning process while perfectly preserving evidence of its mature phase. The simpler explanation is that there was no learning process to preserve because the knowledge was inherited, not invented. The ancient texts themselves insist on this interpretation. They don't claim to be describing new inventions or recent discoveries. They explicitly state that knowledge came from before, from gods, from ancestors, from the time before the flood. Modern scholarship treats these claims as mythology, as primitive people attributing human achievements to supernatural sources. But what if we take them literally? What if the gods they reference are the survivors, the knowledge bearers who bridged the catastrophe? What if the divine wisdom they claim to inherit is actually the preserved knowledge of the antediluvian civilization? The texts become not mythology but testimony, accurate descriptions of cultural restoration rather than cultural genesis. We call it the birth of civilization. They called it restoration. And the evidence suggests they were right. Why do cultures separated by oceans and millennia tell the same story? Not similar stories with regional variations, but fundamentally identical narratives describing the same sequence of events. Darkness followed by fire, water from above and below, the near-total destruction of humanity, and a handful of survivors tasked with rebuilding. This isn't cultural diffusion or borrowing. These accounts were preserved in isolation, developed independently in writing systems that had no contact with each other, yet they describe identical phenomena in language too specific to be coincidental. The answer isn't that these cultures shared mythological traditions. The answer is that they shared ancestors who survived the same catastrophe, and that trauma imprinted itself so deeply that it survived in collective memory for hundreds of generations. The Mesopotamian accounts describe a flood that lasted 6 days and 7 nights, preceded by darkness and fire from the sky. The Hebrew Genesis account describes 40 days of rain, with water bursting from underground springs, darkness covering the earth, and destruction so complete that only 8 humans survived. The Greek accounts preserved by Ovid describe Deucalion's flood, with Zeus drowning humanity for its wickedness, water covering the mountains, and only 2 survivors remaining to repopulate the earth. These 3 accounts come from cultures with documented contact, so skeptics can argue for borrowing. But the pattern extends far beyond the Mediterranean world into regions that had zero contact with Middle Eastern civilizations. The Hindu Matsya Purana describes Manu warned of coming destruction by a divine fish, building a vessel to survive floods that cover the earth, with fire and darkness preceding the water. The account specifies that the flood wasn't gradual. It came suddenly, with waters rising from the ocean and falling from the sky simultaneously. The survivors landed on a mountain peak after the waters receded, and from there, humanity was restored. The specifics match the Mesopotamian accounts, despite being developed in complete isolation from them. The geological events described, simultaneous flooding from oceanic sources and atmospheric precipitation, preceded by celestial disturbance, are too specific to be independent invention. Chinese legends preserved in the Huainanzi describe Gun and Yu battling floods that covered the earth, with water coming from broken heavenly pillars and disturbed earthly corners. The account describes a cosmic catastrophe that disrupted the normal order, causing waters to overflow their boundaries and cover the land. The solution required massive engineering projects to channel waters back into proper courses, suggesting that the flooding was so severe it permanently altered geography. The cultural memory emphasizes that this wasn't normal flooding. It was world-ending catastrophe that required divine intervention to survive. Native American traditions from tribes across the continent preserve parallel accounts. The Ojibwe tell of Nenabojo surviving a great flood by climbing a mountain, with only a handful of animals surviving alongside him. The Hopi describe multiple world ages, with the third world destroyed by flood after the sky opened and water poured down continuously. The Cree legends speak of Wissakedjak, warning of coming floods and building a raft to survive, with the earth being remade after the waters receded. These accounts weren't influenced by Christian missionaries. They existed in oral tradition before European contact, preserved with remarkable consistency across tribes separated by thousands of miles. South American traditions show the same pattern. The Muisca of Colombia describe Chipchacum flooding the earth in anger, with only mountain peaks remaining above water. The Inca legends speak of Viracocha destroying the previous world with flood, with survivors emerging from caves after waters receded to repopulate the earth. The Mapuche of Chile preserve accounts of Kai Kai and Tren Tren, the serpents of water and earth battling until flood covered the land, and only those who reached high mountains survived. The Maya Popol Vuh explicitly states that previous worlds were destroyed by flood, with the current humanity being the 4th creation after 3 previous attempts were annihilated. Australian Aboriginal traditions preserve geographically specific flood memories, that describe landscapes now underwater. The Narunga people describe how Kangaroo Island separated from the mainland when the sea rose, drowning the land bridge and creating the channel that exists today. Geological surveys confirm that Kangaroo Island was connected to mainland Australia until approximately 10,000 years ago, when rising sea levels flooded the connection. The Aboriginal account preserves accurate geographical detail about landscapes that have been submerged for 100 centuries, passed down through 300 generations of oral tradition. This isn't mythology, it's testimony. The consistency extends beyond narrative structure to specific details that shouldn't be shared across isolated cultures. Multiple traditions describe the flood being preceded by unusual celestial phenomena: stars falling, sky darkening during daylight, fire raining from above. Multiple traditions specify that water came from both sky and underground sources simultaneously. Multiple traditions describe a small number of survivors, often 8 or a number close to 8, tasked with preserving knowledge and repopulating humanity. Multiple traditions describe survivors landing on mountain peaks and using birds to determine when waters had receded enough to disembark. These aren't archetypal story patterns common to human mythology. They're specific, detailed, consistent accounts that suggest shared eyewitness experience. Genetic evidence supports the cultural memory. Human mitochondrial DNA shows a population bottleneck approximately 12,000 years ago, a dramatic reduction in genetic diversity suggesting that human population crashed to a fraction of previous levels. This bottleneck is visible across all human populations worldwide, indicating a global rather than regional catastrophe. The timing coincides exactly with the geological and archaeological evidence of catastrophic flooding at the end of the Younger Dryas period. The genetic record confirms what the cultural memory insists. Humanity nearly went extinct, and everyone alive today descends from a small survivor population that lived through unimaginable catastrophe. But the memory preserved more than just the event. It preserved the warning. Across cultures, flood narratives emphasize that the catastrophe was preceded by signs, that warnings were given, that some people recognized what was coming and prepared, while others ignored the evidence until too late. This recurring element isn't random. It's the survivors trying to ensure their descendants would recognize the signs if catastrophe approached again. The stories function as cultural immune systems, preserving information about existential threats across generations so that future populations might have better chance of survival. The trauma of the flood event imprinted itself at a level deeper than conscious cultural transmission. The human brain's threat detection systems evolved to recognize and remember dangers that threaten survival. Catastrophic flooding, fire from sky, and darkness are archetypal fears that appear in nightmares across cultures. Not because of Jungian collective unconscious, but because these threats nearly exterminated our species, and the survivors' trauma wired itself into the psychological inheritance they passed to descendants. The fear of water overwhelming safe spaces, of sky turning hostile, of darkness that won't end. These aren't symbolic anxieties. They're genetic memories of real events that killed most of the human population. The flood narratives also preserve something else, the memory of a world before. A time when things were different, when knowledge was greater, when civilization was more advanced. Nearly every flood tradition includes elements describing the antediluvian world as a time of greater wisdom, longer lives, or more direct connection to divine knowledge. The Sumerian king list describes this explicitly with its antediluvian rulers and their impossible reigns. The Hebrew tradition describes it with the long-lived patriarchs before the flood and the shortened lifespans after. The Hindu accounts describe it as an earlier age when gods walked among men. This isn't nostalgia or Golden Age mythology. It's memory of an actual civilization that existed before the catastrophe, preserved in the only form that could survive total societal collapse: story. What makes these flood narratives genuinely remarkable is their insistence across cultures that the catastrophe was survivable with preparation, that warning signs existed, that those who paid attention to celestial changes and built accordingly managed to preserve themselves and their knowledge. This recurring element transforms the narratives from simple disaster accounts into instruction manuals. They're not just remembering what happened, they're teaching descendants how to survive if it happens again. The stories preserve the warning because the survivors knew the catastrophe could repeat. They encoded the signs to watch for: celestial disturbances, environmental changes, rising waters. They embedded the message that these threats are real, that catastrophe at civilization-ending scale has happened before and could happen again. The genetic memory isn't abstract. It's recorded in DNA, preserved in cultural tradition, visible in the archaeological record, and consistent across independent human populations worldwide. The catastrophe that nearly ended humanity approximately 12,000 years ago left marks deeper than any other event in our species' history. And those marks remain because the survivors made certain they would remain. They told the story until it became permanent, until it embedded itself in every culture's foundation narrative, until even cultures that had no contact with each other were telling versions of the same testimony. We are all descendants of survivors. The flood is our shared origin story, not as metaphor, but as memory. And the memory persists because those who lived through it understood that forgetting would be fatal. The old world ended in a single night, and what followed wasn't noise, it was silence. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of absence, the silence of knowledge lost, of voices extinguished, of questions that can no longer be asked because no one remembers they need answering. That silence echoes through everything we call civilization. It lives in the gaps between what ancient texts claim and what we're willing to believe. It resonates in the sophisticated mathematics that appears without precursors, in the monuments that shouldn't exist according to our developmental timelines, in the flood layers that divide archaeological strata like knife cuts through history. We live in that silence still, mistaking our reconstruction for original creation, our fragments for complete understanding, our amnesia for enlightenment. The silence is loudest in the monuments themselves. When you stand before the Great Pyramid, the structure doesn't speak through hieroglyphs or inscriptions. It speaks through mathematical relationships encoded in its dimensions, through astronomical alignments preserved in its passages, through engineering sophistication that we struggle to replicate with modern technology. But we can't hear what it's saying because we've lost the context. We see a tomb because that's the only explanation that fits our narrative of gradual development, from primitive to advanced. The possibility that it's something else, an archive, a marker, a preservation system built by people who knew their world was ending, remains outside acceptable discourse because accepting it would require rewriting everything we think we know about human history. The silence persists in academic institutions that can't acknowledge the evidence without dismantling their own frameworks. The flood layers exist. The impact evidence is documented. The genetic bottleneck is measurable. The mathematical sophistication appearing without developmental stages is undeniable. The cross-cultural consistency of catastrophe narratives defies explanation through independent invention. Yet the standard narrative remains unchanged because the alternative is too disruptive. If civilization didn't begin 5,000 years ago but was restored after catastrophic collapse of something older and more sophisticated, then every textbook needs rewriting. Every timeline needs revision. Every assumption about human development becomes questionable. The silence protects us from that disruption, from the uncomfortable implications of accepting that we're not the pinnacle of human achievement, but merely the latest attempt at rebuilding. This silence has practical consequences. We treat ancient warnings as mythology rather than testimony. The flood narratives aren't taken seriously as records of actual events that could recur. The astronomical knowledge encoded in monuments isn't studied as functional information about celestial threats. The survivor accounts describing fire from sky and water from below are filed under comparative mythology rather than disaster preparedness. We've classified crucial information about existential threats as entertainment, as cultural curiosities to be studied by anthropologists, rather than warnings to be heeded by planetary defense experts. The silence has made us vulnerable to exactly the kinds of catastrophes that ended the previous world. Consider what we've lost by not listening. The antediluvian civilizations tracked astronomical cycles that take thousands of years to complete. They built monuments designed to survive and communicate through catastrophic events. They developed knowledge preservation systems redundant enough that fragments survived total societal collapse. They understood that civilization is fragile, that knowledge can be lost completely, that preparation for catastrophe is more important than celebration of current achievement. All of this wisdom was embedded in structures and stories specifically to reach us, to warn us, to give us advantages they didn't have. And we've ignored it, dismissed it, silenced it with academic skepticism and comfortable narratives that let us sleep soundly, believing we're safe because we're modern. The silence is breaking now, slowly, as evidence accumulates beyond the point where it can be ignored. Impact crater discoveries confirm ancient accounts of fire from sky. Genetic studies validate population bottleneck narratives. Climate recognizes rapid catastrophic change as geological reality rather than fringe theory. Archaeological evidence of advanced pre-flood civilizations continues mounting, despite attempts to explain it away. The tablets and monuments and geological strata are speaking louder than the silence that tried to cover them. But the question is whether we'll listen in time, whether we'll recognize the warnings before we need them urgently. Because the cycle isn't broken. The same forces that destroyed the antediluvian world remain active. Earth crosses the same orbital paths where cometary debris streams concentrate. Seismic and volcanic systems that can trigger global catastrophe remain unstable. Climate systems that can shift rapidly between states haven't been stabilized by our industrial civilization. We've potentially made them more volatile. The survivors who lived through the last catastrophe tried desperately to warn us by embedding knowledge in permanent forms. They built monuments that say, "This happened before and can happen again." They preserved stories that say, "Watch the sky, prepare for water, understand that your world can end overnight." They encoded mathematical knowledge that says, "We knew things you're only now rediscovering." And we were still destroyed. The monuments aren't tombs for dead pharaohs. They're warnings from dead civilizations. The flood narratives aren't origin myths. They're survival instructions. The astronomical alignments aren't religious symbolism. They're tracking systems for celestial threats. The mathematical tablets aren't academic exercises. They're computational tools for predicting dangerous cosmic events. Everything the survivors tried to preserve was designed to give us the knowledge we need to avoid their fate. And we've been too proud, too convinced of our own sophistication, too wrapped in the silence of our amnesia to recognize what they were trying to tell us. The silence that remains is our choice now. We can continue treating ancient wisdom as primitive superstition, dismissing evidence that doesn't fit comfortable narratives, maintaining the silence that protects us from uncomfortable truths. Or we can listen to what the stones are saying, what the tablets record, what the survivors tried desperately to preserve through the darkness. We can acknowledge that we're not the first advanced civilization, that knowledge can be lost completely, that catastrophe at species-threatening scale has happened before and will happen again. We can break the silence by taking the warnings seriously, by studying ancient knowledge systems as functional information rather than curious mythology, by recognizing that those who survived the last ending of the world have crucial intelligence to share. The old world didn't fade gently into the past. It was murdered in a night of fire and flood, and its survivors spent their remaining years screaming warnings across the centuries, encoding them in every durable medium they could devise, hoping that somebody, that we, would eventually listen. The silence that followed their screaming isn't the silence of their failure to communicate. It's the silence of our failure to hear. Every monument they built says, "Remember." Every tablet they inscribed says, "Prepare." Every story they told says, "It happened before." And every day we ignore those warnings. We move closer to learning their lessons the hardest way possible. The night the old world ended created a silence that has lasted 12,000 years. That silence is filled with lost knowledge, lost warnings, lost understanding of threats we face again today. But the silence isn't permanent unless we choose to maintain it. The monuments remain. The tablets preserve their testimony. The geological record confirms their accounts. The genetic memory persists in our DNA and our nightmares. The warnings are still available if we're willing to listen, if we're brave enough to acknowledge that we're not as advanced as we think, not as safe as we assume, not exempt from the cycles that ended civilizations before us. We stand now where the antediluvians stood, at the peak of our confidence, convinced our technology makes us invulnerable, dismissing warnings as primitive fears. They built monuments to survive what they couldn't prevent. We build nothing permanent, assuming digital archives will preserve our knowledge forever, that our civilization is too sophisticated to collapse, that catastrophe is something that happened to primitive people in ancient times. The silence whispers that this assumption is fatal, that every civilization that fell believed it was too advanced to fail, that the monuments weren't built by the primitive, but by the doomed. The silence that remains is pregnant with implications we're not ready to accept. It says that progress isn't linear, that we're not the pinnacle, that the story we tell ourselves about human development is backwards. It says that 12,000 years ago, people knew things we're only now rediscovering, built things we can't explain, survived catastrophe that nearly ended humanity, and spent their lives trying to warn us. And it says that we're running out of time to break the silence, to listen to what they preserved, to prepare for what they couldn't prevent. The old world ended in fire and water. The new world lives in silence and forgetting. And unless we learn to hear what the silence contains, we're condemned to repeat the cycle, to become the next layer of ruins beneath the next attempt at civilization. The next warning that future humans will probably ignore.
If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, subscribe, and activate notifications so you don't miss our next videos.